I was still wearing black when my stepson slid the folder across the boardroom table. Not gently, not respectfully. He pushed it toward me like it was already decided. 5 days earlier, I had buried my husband. 5 days after standing in frozen dirt, watching a coffin lower into the ground, I was being fired from the company I helped build. The room smelled like burnt coffee and overheated plastic. That was the first thing my brain latched onto, not faces, not words, just the stale bitterness in the air and the faint chemical heat coming off the copier humming in the corner. My hands were folded in my lap, fingers stiff, knuckles pale against the sleeves of my funeral coat. Across the table sat Daniel Crow, my husband's son. He was sitting in his father's chair. That alone felt wrong. Daniel looked composed in a way grief never allows, hair perfectly styled, navy suit pressed sharp enough to cut, a silver watch still wrapped in that new money shine. He looked like a man stepping into a role he'd rehearsed for, not a man who had lost his father days earlier. Around us were the people who had carried this company for decades. Helen Brooks from operations, sharp eyes, tougher spine. Michael Rowan, CFO, Toledo-born, numbers etched into his bones. And Carl Denning, board chair, the kind of man who shook hands too long and avoided conflict too easily. Every one of them looked uncomfortable. Daniel cleared his throat. "I'll keep this brief," he said. That's when I knew it would hurt. He clicked a small remote, like he was about to start a presentation. No slides appeared. Instead, he placed his palm flat on the table, leaned forward slightly, and met my eyes. "Effective immediately," he said. "Your employment with Crow Industrial Solutions is terminated." The words didn't explode. They settled. Heavy, cold, final. For a second, my hearing dulled, like my body was refusing to process what had just been said. I stared at him, searching for hesitation, for guilt, for even a crack of humanity. There was none. "You're firing me," I said quietly. "Yes," Daniel replied. "We're moving in a new direction." A phrase so empty it almost impressed me. Michael shifted sharply in his chair. Helen's jaw tightened. Carl inhaled like he wanted to object but didn't know how. Daniel continued, voice smooth, practiced. "The company needs modern leadership. Investors expect a clear structure, and frankly, keeping a grieving widow in an executive role creates uncertainty." Widow. He said it like a liability. Something hot crept up my chest, not rage yet, not fully. It was grief being pressed where it still bled. Helen spoke before I could. "With all due respect, she's the reason half our suppliers stayed loyal during the downturn." Daniel smiled politely. "Loyalty isn't a strategy." That sentence told me everything. I slid the folder closer. The paper was crisp, fresh, prepared long before my husband was in the ground. "Is this personal?" I asked. Daniel didn't blink. "Of course not." I let out a soft breath. "My husband died on Thursday. I buried him Saturday. You fire me Tuesday. Forgive me if the timing feels intimate." His eyes flickered, just once, then smoothed again. "My father built this company," he said. "He'd want what's best for it." I wanted to say he built it with me. Instead, I stayed quiet. I opened the folder. Severance language, confidentiality clauses, non-disparagement, cold, clinical sentences written by people who never looked someone in the eye while dismantling their life. Then I saw it. Buried deep, page 6. A clause stating I held no voting interest in the company. Sloppy, incorrect, dangerous. I didn't react. Daniel tapped his pen lightly. "If you sign today, this stays clean. If not, we'll have to pursue other options." "Other options?" I asked. "Legal ones," he said, smiling. Unpleasant ones. Helen snapped. That sounds like a threat. Daniel shrugged. It's transparency. I picked up the pen. Michael's eyes widened. Carl looked sick. Daniel leaned forward, eager. I signed. Every page. And when I reached the incorrect clause, I initialed it too. Because I wasn't giving up anything real. I was letting him believe he'd won. He gathered the folder without thanking me. Security will escort you out. I stood slowly. Grief makes your body heavy. Every movement feels borrowed. I looked around the room once. Take care of each other, I said. Daniel scoffed softly. In the elevator, my reflection looked older than it should have. Black coat, hollow eyes, widow, fired. When I got home, I hung the coat in the closet. My fingers brushed something inside the pocket. A brass paperclip. Bent, familiar. Wrapped around it was a folded yellow note. 2 lines, written in my husband's handwriting. Blue folder, top drawer. If he ever tries this. For the first time since the funeral, I didn't cry. I felt something else. The house was too quiet the next morning. Grief does that. It turns silence into pressure. I stood in the kitchen holding a mug of coffee I didn't remember making, staring at the empty spot on the counter where my husband used to drop his keys every night. The paperclip was still warm in my hand. I checked the note again, as if it might change. It didn't. The blue folder sat exactly where he said it would be. Top drawer, home office. Under files Daniel would never bother to open. I sat slowly, like moving too fast might break something fragile and unseen. Inside were documents I had glimpsed years ago but never studied. Now I read every word. Voting trust agreement. Share transfer. Notarized, filed. 67%. My breath caught, not from surprise but from understanding. 7 years earlier, after one of Daniel's rare visits, my husband had stood at the sink too long, hands braced on the counter. He asked what the company was worth, he'd said. That's normal, I told him. No, he replied, not the way he asked. That night, he protected what mattered. Not from strangers. From blood. Owning the majority didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel responsible, heavy, awake. I drove into town out of habit, past brick buildings, past the river moving slow and gray under winter skis. I stopped at Rosie's diner, where the coffee tasted burnt and the truth traveled fast. I heard, Rosie said, already pouring my mug. That boy's got ice where his heart should be. I didn't argue. My phone buzzed. A message from Helen. He's talking layoffs, big ones, Monday. My stomach dropped. I typed back slowly. Don't say anything yet. I'm handling it. I didn't know how, not fully, but I knew I couldn't walk away. That afternoon, I stood at my husband's grave. The ground was hard, the stones still new. I didn't ask for this, I said out loud, but I won't let him erase you. The wind cut sharp, honest. My phone rang. A familiar voice chuckled softly. Still answering your own phone. Good sign. Harold, I said. Meet me at the barber shop on Lasky, he replied, and bring the blue folder. When I hung up, I realized something important. Daniel thought he'd ended my story. In reality, he'd only revealed his. And Monday was coming. Lou's barbershop hadn't changed in 20 years. Same cracked vinyl chairs along the wall. Same red and white pole buzzing outside like it was stuck in time. Same corkboard cluttered with flyers for fish fries, raffles, and events that had already passed. Places like this don't update, because they don't need to. Truth ages well here. Harold Klein sat in the last chair, half hidden beneath a striped cape, wire-rim glasses low on his nose. He was reading the local paper like the world still moved at a reasonable pace. He saw me in the mirror and smiled. "You look tired," he said. "I am," I replied. "That's honest," he said. "Sit." Lou didn't ask questions. He never did. He just nodded and kept the clippers humming, as if the sound itself was a privacy agreement. When we were alone in the back room, I set the blue folder on the metal table between us. Harold didn't open it right away. Instead, he studied my face. "You sure you want to walk this road?" he asked quietly. I thought of the boardroom. The folder sliding across the table. Daniel sitting in my husband's chair like he'd earned it. "I think my husband started this road," I said. "I'm just finishing it." Harold nodded once and opened the folder. He read slowly, carefully, the way men do when they know speed is how mistakes happen. His finger traced signatures, stamps, dates. He checked each page twice. Finally, he leaned back. "Well," he said, "that's airtight." I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "He doesn't know," I said. Harold's mouth twitched. "No, and that's the dangerous part for him." He closed the folder. "Daniel thinks he inherited a throne. What he's sitting on is a folding chair with one loose leg." I almost smiled. Almost. "But," Harold continued, raising a finger, "this only works if you don't rush." My jaw tightened. "He's talking layoffs." "I know." "Monday." "I know." I leaned forward. "Then we stop him now." Harold shook his head. "No, not yet." Frustration surged hot and fast. "Every day I wait, people suffer." "And if you act too soon," Harold said calmly, "he paints you as emotional, unstable, the grieving widow who lost perspective." I hated how right he sounded. "He wants witnesses," Harold continued. "A big meeting, a grand speech. He wants to look like a visionary." I sat back slowly, so I let him talk. "You let him reveal himself." Silence settled between us, heavy but clear. "You show up Monday," Harold said. "You sit in the back, you don't interrupt, you don't react. You let him sell his future." "And then?" I asked. "And then," Harold said, voice steady, "you remind everyone who actually owns the house." I drove home with the folder on the passenger seat, like a quiet passenger. That night, my phone buzzed again and again. Messages from people who didn't know what to say, but felt something was wrong. From Michael, "Be careful, he's moving fast." From Helen, "People are scared." I stood in the spare bedroom, my husband's old desk still neat, lamp angled just how he liked it. I touched the edge of the desk and whispered, "I'm trying." Monday was 3 days away. And Daniel had no idea how little room he had left. By Friday, rumors stopped whispering. They printed themselves into spreadsheets. Helen called just after lunch. Her voice was tight, controlled, like someone holding something fragile with both hands. "They're real," she said. 53 names. I closed my eyes. "Who?" I asked. She didn't hesitate. That hurt more than anything. Maintenance, shipping, purchasing. People who had stayed through lean years because they believed loyalty mattered. "When is he telling them?" I asked. "After the board meeting Monday." Phase 1, he was calling it. That afternoon, Daniel hosted what he called a leadership lunch at a chain restaurant off the highway. Beige walls, laminated menus, TVs bolted too high to matter. I parked across the lot. I told myself I wouldn't go in. I went in. I took a seat near the back, hat low, ordered water I didn't touch. Daniel stood near the bar, holding court. "We can't run this place like a museum," he said, laughing lightly. "Nostalgia doesn't pay invoices." A few people chuckled. nervous, obedient. The old guard had their time, he continued. Now it's about efficiency, streamlining tough calls. My heart started pounding, hard, loud. Emotions cloud judgment, Daniel said. Frankly, my stepmother never understood that. Something in me snapped. I stood before I realized I was moving. Helen caught my eye from across the room and shook her head once. Just once. I sat back down. My hands were shaking now, not from fear but restraint. I left before dessert. Outside, the cold slapped my face and steadied me. That night, sleep refused to come. My chest felt tight, pressure building behind my eyes. At 3 a.m, I checked my blood pressure with the cuff my husband insisted we keep. Too high. I laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because it was human. A woman in her late 50s, grieving, underestimated, waiting to outlast a man with a spreadsheet and too much confidence. Sunday morning, Michael texted. Emergency pre-meeting tonight. He's trying to lock votes. I called Harold. He's pushing, I said. I know, Harold replied, calm as ever. That means he's nervous. He could railroad this. He won't, Harold said. He needs Monday, he needs an audience. That evening, I laid out the gray suit my husband bought me years ago. Nothing flashy, just solid. I slipped the brass paperclip into the inside pocket. My phone buzzed again. Security will be present at tomorrow's meeting. I smiled for the first time in days. Good, I whispered to the empty room. Let them watch. Monday was coming. And Daniel was about to discover the difference between control and ownership. Monday arrived without mercy. Gray sky, knife-cold wind. The kind of morning that presses down on you before you've even stepped outside. As I crossed the parking lot, the flag out front snapped hard, sharp enough to sting. I paused with my hand on the door. One breath in. One breath out. Inside, the building smelled the same as it always had. Coffee, oil, faint cleaning solution. Familiar, steady, like it was waiting to see who would respect it. I signed in with security. Visitor badge. That stung more than I expected. The boardroom was already full. Executives lined the wall. Board members sat rigid around the table. On the screen at the far end, Zoom windows flickered to life. Outside counsel, private equity reps in sleek offices, and one local business reporter who definitely wasn't there by accident. Daniel stood at the head of the table, hands braced on the polished wood, smiling like this was his coronation. I took the seat in the back. Exactly where Harold told me to sit. My pulse thudded in my ears, but my body stayed still. I rested the worn leather envelope on my lap and folded my hands over it. Good morning, Daniel said brightly. Today is about the future. The first slide appeared. Arrows, buzzwords, promises. He spoke for 20 minutes straight. About efficiency. About modernization. About how sentimentality had slowed growth. I watched the room, not the screen. Michael's jaw tightened with every sentence. Helen stared at the table. Carl looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. And that brings us to phase 1, Daniel said, smiling wider. Strategic workforce reduction. A murmur rippled. One of the investors nodded approvingly on the screen. Daniel didn't miss a beat. Leadership requires difficult choices. He clicked again. I'm calling for a vote to authorize the partnership and approve governance changes. Before the room could respond, I stood. I need to speak. Silence crashed down. Every head turned. Daniel blinked, then laughed softly. This is a board meeting. Yes, I said. That's why this matters. I walked forward and placed the leather envelope on the table in front of him. The sound wasn't loud. Just final. You don't have standing here, Daniel said sharply. You were terminated. I glanced at Carl. Would you like to explain? Carl swallowed, said nothing. I looked back at Daniel. You can open it. For a moment, he hesitated. Then he smirked and flipped it open. Documents filled the screen as counsel projected them. Stamps, signatures, dates. I hold 67% of the voting shares of this company, I said calmly. No raised voice, no anger. Just fact. The room froze. On Zoom, one investor leaned closer to the camera. The reporter's eyes widened. That's not possible, Daniel said. His voice cracked. It is, I replied. You signed severance, he snapped. Employment isn't ownership, counsel said quietly. Daniel's face drained of color. I turned to the board. All proposed layoffs are suspended. The partnership is paused. And Daniel's authority as CEO is revoked effective immediately. Carl exhaled like he'd been underwater too long. All in favor. Hands rose, one by one. Daniel stared around the room, stunned. Security stepped forward, not aggressive, just firm. As he was escorted out past the glass wall, employees gathered silently. No shouting. Just collapse. I sat down. My hands shook now. The building felt different once Daniel was gone. Not quieter. Steadier. Lawyers packed up without conversation. Zoom screens winked out one by one. The reporter slipped away, already crafting her headline. I stayed seated, palms flat on the table until the shaking stopped. Michael sat beside me and placed a hand on my shoulder. You okay? I will be, I said. Helen stepped forward, eyes bright. They're cheering on the floor. I nodded. Good. Carl cleared his throat. What do you want to do now? I looked around the room. My husband had once commanded with quiet authority. I don't want the CEO title, I said. Surprise flickered. We form an interim committee, I continued. Operations, finance, plant leadership, no secret deals, no sudden cuts. Helen smiled softly. That sounds like him. That afternoon, I walked the floor. Not as a victor, just present. Tom Riley stepped forward, hands rough as ever. Is it true about the layoffs? They're off the table, I said. We'll do this right. He exhaled, shoulders dropping. Thank you. By the end of the week, the noise faded. Daniel's name stopped coming up. We reached a quiet settlement. No speeches, no apologies, just closure. One evening, alone in my husband's office, I made tea the way he liked it. I sat in his chair and looked out toward the plant lights glowing against the dark. The shift change siren sounded low and familiar. I pulled the brass paperclip from my pocket. Bent, ordinary, powerful in its simplicity. You trusted me, I whispered. I didn't waste it. Grief stayed, but it softened. It had shape now. Meaning. Victory never looks the way people imagine it does. There were no celebrations, no champagne, no speeches echoing through the halls. Just work. The week after the board meeting was heavier than the one before it, not because of fear this time, but because of responsibility. When people stop panicking, they start watching. Every decision mattered now. I felt it in the way people looked at me. Not admiration. Not relief alone. Expectation. I arrived early every morning, not because I had to, but because the building deserved consistency. The lights came on one by one, the same as they always had. Machines hummed, coffee brewed, life went on. Helen and Michael met with me daily. Not to flatter, not to stall, just to rebuild trust where it had been shaken. We need to be careful, Michael said one morning, spreading reports across the table. People are listening for tone as much as policy. He was right. Patience had a cost. I saw it in the exhaustion on Helen's face, in the quiet conversations that stopped when I walked by, not from secrecy, but from people not wanting to burden me. I corrected that quickly. Talk, I told them. I can't protect what I can't hear. The layoffs stayed off the table, but we didn't pretend everything was perfect. We addressed inefficiencies honestly. We slowed decisions that had been rushed. We listened to people who'd never been asked what worked before. That was the part Daniel never understood. Leadership isn't speed. It's direction. One afternoon, I received a message from an unknown number. You humiliated me. I didn't reply. That chapter was already closed. Instead, I drove to the cemetery after work. The sky was low and heavy, threatening snow. I knelt carefully and brushed frost from the stone. I didn't do it loudly, I said. I hope that's okay. The wind answered for him. Time softened things. Not erased them, but softened the sharpest edges. The interim committee found its rhythm. Decisions slowed just enough to become thoughtful again. Suppliers returned calls faster. Employees stopped bracing for bad news every Monday morning. Trust crept back quietly. One evening, as I locked up, Tom Riley caught up to me near the exit. Ma'am, he said, awkward as ever. I just wanted to say it feels like before again. I nodded. That's the goal. Driving home, I realized something important. Daniel had wanted control. I wanted continuity. There's a difference. At home, the house no longer felt like it was holding its breath. I still noticed the empty chair, the untouched mug, the familiar silences, but they didn't crush me anymore. They reminded me. Some nights, I sat at the kitchen table with the brass paperclip between my fingers, turning it slowly, grounding myself in its simplicity. Quiet strength doesn't announce itself. It waits. It prepares. It endures. And when it finally moves, it doesn't need permission. Months later, the company stabilized. Not spectacularly, not dramatically, but honestly. We announced modest growth, sustainable plans, no flashy headlines. The reporter who once watched Daniel fall now wrote a different story, about steadiness, about recovery, about leadership without spectacle. I declined interviews. Some stories don't need a face. On my last day as interim chair, I walked the floor one more time. People waved, smiled, returned to their work. That's how I knew it was right. At the exit, I paused and looked back. The building didn't need me anymore. That was the point. That evening, I returned to the cemetery as the sun dipped low. I placed the brass paperclip at the base of the stone again. Finished, I said softly. The wind moved through the trees, steady and calm. I walked back to my car, lighter than I'd felt in a long time. Some people think power is loud. It is. Real power is knowing when to wait, when to move, and when to let go. If you've ever been underestimated, erased, or quietly pushed aside, remember this. Patience isn't weakness. Silence isn't surrender. Sometimes, the quiet ones finish the story exactly the way it needs to end.